Hey, on my way to work again, just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts regarding the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this Passover week, this Passion week. And if you remember my other video on leaven and how it represents sin, and how unleavened bread represents purity and holiness, I was just thinking, throughout the years we eat things with yeast and leaven in it. Um, we leave crumbs everywhere we go. Doesn't matter how clean or how proper we try to be when we eat. When we're eating leavened bread, you can't help but leave crumbs behind. And you can sweep them up, you can mop them up, but every time during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where you're required to, um, clean your homes and get out the yeast and get out the leaven, um, you'll always find it in little corners, little nooks and crannies, and little places that you just didn't expect or think, how in the heck could breadcrumbs get here? Just through walking around and moving about and air currents and things like that, just crumbs get everywhere and it just kind of permeates and saturates everything. It gets in couch cushions and nooks and crannies and corners of the house and appliances and all this kind of stuff. Well, just as equally, the same occurs with unleavened bread. Just as sin finds its way into the little nooks and crannies of our hearts and our lives and our minds, it's the same with purity. It's the same with holiness. Because, I know there's some people who make their own unleavened bread, but I usually go to the store and buy, matzah in the boxes. And by the way, everything matzah with melted cheese on it, oh, it's delicious. Anyway, you can't eat unleavened bread without getting crumbs everywhere. I mean, every time I bite or crunch into a crispy matzah sheet, a matzah wafer, I look down. It's in my beard. It's on my clothes. It's everywhere. And I get up, it falls onto the ground and makes its way to all the nooks and crannies of the house. No matter how hard I try to be neat and tidy and clean, the crumbs just fall everywhere. And isn't that just kind of representatory of our lives? Like, when we're living in sin and we move about and we walk about, we leave sinful breadcrumbs. We leave a mark. We leave a path wherever we go. Because our sin just doesn't affect ourselves, it affects other people around us. It's no different than tossing a pebble into a pond and it creates ripples. The ripple effects will make it all the way to the shore. So your sin affects everybody around you. They see it, they feel it, they pick up on it, they're influenced by it, by what you say, by what you do, by how you feel, by your attitude, by how you emote, all these things. And it's just the same with holiness and with purity. Um, when we walk in holiness and we walk in purity, it leaves a trail. It leaves holy breadcrumbs wherever we go, and people pick up on it, and they see it, and they're attracted to it, and they follow it, and it influences them. So in the exact same way, um, and I just think that's just very interesting. So you could either choose one of two paths. You can choose the path of sin or the path of holiness. Both are going to leave their print. Both are going to leave their mark. Both are going to leave their influence. And it's up to you to decide which path you're going to take. And, I think of the story of Peter, that, at one point, that even his shadow passing by other people, people were healed and touched by even Peter's shadow because he was walking in holiness. He was walking in purity. I think of Yeshua and his disciples when the Gentile woman and said, Lord, please help my daughter. And he's like, well, I'm just called just to the house of Israel, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And it's not right to give the bread that's meant for the children to the household animals, to the household pets. And she said, well, Lord, even the pets get the crumbs from the master's table. And so everywhere Yeshua went, he left crumbs of holiness. Wherever the apostles went, they left crumbs of holiness that people picked up on. While the believers were eating from the bread, the non-believers were just picking up on the crumbs, and they were getting hungry, they were getting curious, they were wanting more, and it caused them to seek out the bread, the true bread, the bread of life. And Yeshua says, "I am the bread of life." He says that in the book of, or the Gospel of John. And just think where Yeshua was born. He was born in Bethlehem. In Hebrew, that is Bet-lechem. He was born in the house of bread. And he is the bread of life. And this bread of life, where was he laid? Not in a cradle. He was laid in a feeding trough, in an animal feeding trough. What usually goes in an animal feeding trough? Well, if you're feeding cattle and livestock, you're usually feeding them grain, which is the very source and essence of where bread comes from. So the bread of life, Yeshua, was laid in a feeding trough that holds bread, life, and he was born in the city, or the house of bread, Bethlehem. And he was the pure, unblemished, unspotted, unleavened bread of life. So as you are going through this Passion Week, going through this week of Feast of Unleavened Bread, please keep these things in mind and remember these things. And unleavened bread is called the bread of affliction because it was when we were cast out of Egypt and driven out of Egypt. And, we took our bread with us in our kneading bowls, and it didn't even have a chance to rise or to become leavened. And so that's why it's called the bread of affliction, because we ate it in a rush as we were leaving Egypt. And, sometimes that's how holiness comes about. Holiness is the catalyst. It's the precursor. It's that first domino that's tipped over that leads us to holiness. So suffering and affliction leads to purification, leads to the unleavening process, leads to holiness. So remember that when you're going through a rough time, a hard time, when you're persecuted, you're being hounded, just remember that this is the refining process. This is the pathway to holiness, and that you're being purged of that leaven. And so it's a good thing. It's a great thing. The rewards and the benefits of that are just so great. So just as when you're sinning and you can't help but get the crumbs of sin all over you and all over everybody else and all over everything around you, and it permeates everything, the nooks and crannies of your house. The same with holiness. When you eat unleavened bread, it gets all over, even more so, really. It gets all over, it gets on the floor, into the nooks and crannies, and we want holiness to permeate our living space, to permeate our house, we just want to leave holy crumbs behind us as we live our life and as we walk and as we live out the example of Messiah Yeshua for others in our lives. So love you guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hope this kind of sparked something in you and will bless you during this Passion Week, during this week of Feast of Unleavened Bread. See you later. Shalom and Shavua Tov.